China Money Podcast. I'm your host, Nina Xiang. Our guest today is David Gosset, Director at the Euro-China Center for International and Business Relations at the China-Europe International Business School. And he's talking to me here today in Beijing. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you very much.
So Premier Wen Jiabao has clearly signaled that China will help Europe to overcome its debt crisis. So what kind of role do you think China can and will play?
You know, what is very interesting is that from the very beginning of the Euro story, China has been always very supportive. Under the Prodi Commission, I remember President Jiang Zemin telling the European counterpart, we are going to support the euro because we want to live in a multipolar world. And this is not about business, this is not about economics, it's about politics. So now it is true that in the aftermath of the big financial crisis, 2008, the Eurozone is facing some problems. Premier Wen said that China will support the euro, and he said something very important. He said to the Chinese media, he said, to help Europe is to help ourselves. And here he was working with the Chinese public opinion. From a Chinese perspective, the EU is the largest trade partner. But probably this year we will see something happening very, very interesting. China is going to become the first trade partner of the EU before the United States of America. You know, when you look at the EU-China trade, more than 30%, in fact, it's Germany-China trade. And from a German perspective, already 5% of German exports go to China. And for the first time this year, at the end of 2012, the first trading partner of Germany outside of the EU will be China. So very significant changes.
So do you think China would either go through the European Financial Stability Facility or going through IMF or any other channel in helping Europe?
I don't think we will have yet precise ideas on this. We will have declarations of principle. And I think that China would like better to go through the IMF than to go directly through the new mechanisms in Europe. And if China goes through the IMF, it also allows China to have a bigger say within the IMF. And this is a very important also part of the story. But on the long term, mid-term, long-term, what also matters a lot is how much China is going to invest, and here we are talking about the Chinese companies, are going to invest in Europe. I believe that in the coming years we have two major business stories. First one is of course the Chinese consumer. This is very clear. And the second business story that one needs to analyze, but we are at the beginning of this story, is China's investment outside of China. China's overseas direct investment, China's ODI. And some reports are talking about the number, a huge number. China is going to invest more than $1 trillion US outside of China in the coming decade. For the moment, most of the Chinese ODI, they go to the Asia-Pacific region, Asia. A small amount of the investment, Chinese investment, goes to Europe. And it is in the interest of Europe to change the dynamics. So the EU has to create the conditions to attract more Chinese investment.
What kind of risk or backlash, if you will, China should be prepared for when it's investing more in Europe?
The globalization of the Chinese companies, we are at the beginning of that, so there are a lot of traps. It is difficult to go global, but I am sure that the Chinese companies are learning very, very, very rapidly, and you have already extremely successful Chinese companies doing business in Europe. Here I am thinking one of them, of course, huge name, Huawei, is very successful, and a company like Huawei is creating jobs.
As we all know, companies like Huawei has encountered problems in the US. Do you imagine that they could possibly run into similar problems in Europe?
It could, but as you said very well, this very company faced this kind of problems in the US, with the US obsession of security, national security issues, while Huawei, of course, is not threatening anyone in the US. From that perspective, the business environment in the EU is better than the business environment to a certain extent from that point of view in the US.
What could China ask for return for its help to Europe, aside from what you just described, more say in the IMF for China?
My opinion, and you have some commentators and you have some analysts who are saying that in return, China would like to see the lift of the arms embargo and to see the EU granting China the market economy status. I observe that this is not what is said by the Chinese government. There is no trade-off. There is no trade-off. China is not going to ask the EU impossible things. Of course, we know that China would like to see the EU to lift the arms embargo. We could have done, we should do that, but for some reasons it's not going to happen, certainly next week. And in any case, for the market economy status, China will get it automatically according to the WTO rules in 2016. So again, I think that the EU should grant China the market economy status, but we have to deal with realities. I would like to repeat something very simple, but I think very important. The European integration process has been a series of answers to a series of crises. The euro debt crisis is another important crisis, probably the third biggest crisis that Europe is facing since the end of World War II. And the result of that is going to be more European integration, more transfer of sovereignty.
So the China-Euro Summit is going to be held in 2 days on Valentine's Day, actually. So what do you think both sides should and will achieve from this meeting?
I think it's going to be the symbol of a new phase in the EU-China relations, a phase that we would call indispensable partnership between the EU and China. I don't expect huge declarations. I expect a summit which will be in continuity with what has been achieved in the recent months.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.